Welcome to the second video on violence, discrimination and neglect towards Tibetan children, a report submitted to the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child on violations of the Convention on the Rights of the Child by the People's Republic of China against the children of Tibet. The Tibetan people also have a right to self-determination. By self-determination we mean the collective right of a people to determine freely their own political status and to pursue their own economic, social and cultural development. CEG International Convent on Civil and Political Rights, Article 1, 2002 21 of 16th December 1966, entered into force 3rd January 1976. The Tibetans are a people with a common history, racial and ethnic identity, distinct culture and language, definable territory and common economic ties in terms of the right to self-determination. London Statement Supranota 4 at page 145 to 46. And note 7, yes to self-determination. Those notes doesn't function. I'm sorry. So I just leave them. I leave them and focus on the main text, if that's okay. China's occupation of Tibet and its failure to honor the Tibetan people's right to self-determination are the root cause of the violations of Tibetan children's rights that we report on here. We recognize that the principle of self-determination is widely considered a preemptory norm of jus cogens. Let's take the note, jus cogens. CEG H. Gross SBL, Report on the Right to Self-Determination. UN document number at page in particular, Rapporteur Gross SBL states, no one can challenge the fact that in light of contemporary international realities, the principle of self-determination necessarily possesses the character of jus cogens. International Court of Justice Judge Amon states, self-determination is a norm of jus cogens, derogation from which is not permitted under any circumstances. Legal consequences for states of the continued presence of South Africa in Namibia, SV Africa notwithstanding Security Council Resolution 276 1971. Yes. China's occupation of Tibet and its failure to honor the Tibetan people's right to self-determination are the root cause of the violations of Tibetan children's rights that we report on here. We recognize that the principle of self-determination is widely considered a preemptory norm of jus cogens. That was. Accordingly, we urge the committee to give full legal weight to the principle of self-determination as it considers the evidence of gross violations of the Convention by China against Tibetan children. B. The Third Forum on Work in Tibet. At the time of this committee's review of China's initial report, political and religious repression in Tibet had been escalating since nationalist demonstrations broke out in Lhasa in 1987. The new repressive measures reflected an accurate perception on the part of high-level Chinese Communist Party (CCP) officials of intensifying resistance to the Chinese occupation, as well as the spread of protest from urban centers like Lhasa, located in central Tibet, the former Tibetan province of Yutang, to rural and eastern Tibet, the former Tibetan provinces of Kham and Amdo. In late July 1994, the government of China held a conference in Beijing known as the Third National Forum on Work in Tibet. Third Forum. Note on Third Forum, we have here, see Tibet Information Network, TIN, Hostile Elements, a study of political imprisonment in Tibet 1987 to 1998. Hereafter, Hostile Elements, TIN and Human Rights Watch Asia, Cutting Off the Serpent's Head, Tightening Control in Tibet 1994 to 1995. Hereafter, TIN and HRW Asia. Yes. The Third Forum, ostensibly to develop policies to expedite economic growth in the TAR. In fact, the Third Forum brought about the most fundamental revision of policies on Tibet since the relaxation of hardline Maoist policies in 1979. Note 10. TIN and HRW Asia. Supranote 9 at 1. The Third Forum led the CCP to reformulate strategies to tighten its control over Tibet and to sanction a new series of repressive policies intended to stifle the persistence of social and political dissent against China's occupation. These included most prominently 1. The initiation of patriotic re-education, campaigns in monasteries and nunneries to increase the government's control of religious activity in Tibet. 2. Purges of Tibetan cadres and government employees suspected of harboring nationalist sympathies. 3. An aggressive campaign to discredit the Dalai Lama by means of propaganda that for the first time sought to undermine his continuing religious as well as political influence among Tibetans. 4. A policy of transferring huge numbers of Chinese settlers into Tibet. And 5. An initiative to assert greater control over the education of Tibetan children. 11. Note 11. Tibetan Center for Human Rights and Democracy, the Next Generation, the State of Education in Tibet Today. The Next Generation called hereafter. The impact of the Third Forum continues to this day. Note 12. Hostile Elements, Supranota 9, 10 News Update. Religious crackdown intensifies in Lhasa, August 25, 2000. New religious restrictions threaten Tibetan traditions. July 26, 2000. 10 News Update. Harsher measures to enforce ban on Dalai Lama's birthday celebrations. August 6, 1999. Yes. In large measure, it defines the social, economic and political atmosphere in which Tibetans presently live. Under Chinese rule, the Tibetan people have suffered violations of the full range of civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights that modern international law guarantees to all persons. Almost invariably, these violations originate in and are symptomatic of the Chinese government's systematic efforts to impose Chinese political, economic, and social systems on the Tibetan people and to suppress any nationalist sentiment by Tibetans. Over the years, non-governmental organizations, foreign governments, and journalists alike have documented widespread human rights abuses against Tibetans, including torture, political imprisonment, religious repression, discrimination in employment, education and government, cultural destruction, environmental degradation, and exploitation of Tibet's natural resources. Most recently, governmental policies intended to encourage mass resettlement of Chinese into Tibet have reduced Tibetans to, in the words of one recent study, strangers in their own country. Lhasa, Tibet's capital, is now populated predominantly by Chinese. For 50 years, the government of China has adopted policies towards Tibet that have had a direct and negative impact on the lives of Tibetan children. Our report shows that these range from the perhaps unintended consequence of malnutrition, caused at least in part by the imposition of economic structures unfamiliar to Tibetan culture, to the increasingly blunt effort to assimilate Tibetan children through the educational system, to the cruel practices of detaining and torturing Tibetan children in order to terrorize them and other Tibetans into political and cultural allegiance to China. Indeed, China's torture of Tibetan children shows just how deeply focused its authorities remain on destroying any perceived manifestation of Tibetan nationalism. C. Fact-finding regarding Tibetan children. This report is based largely on a fact-finding mission Tibet Justice Center conducted in 1999 from October 29 to November 10, 1999. A team comprised of Tibet Justice Center psychologists and lawyers interviewed 57 Tibetan children who now live, study and work within refugee communities in northern India. The team used a standard questionnaire developed by Tibet Justice Center in consultation with teachers, doctors and healthcare workers, as well as human rights experts. Research within Tibet would have been desirable, but the government of China forbids all non-governmental organizations, including purely humanitarian organizations such as the International Committee of the Red Cross, from independent monitoring in Tibet. Interviews represented a broad demographic cross-section of Tibetan society. Some grew up in Lhasa or other urban centers, others in rural and nomadic communities. Some lived in Yutang, the region roughly equivalent to the Tar. Others in eastern Tibetan regions of Kham and Amdo, now incorporated into Chinese provinces. At the time of the interviews, children ranged in age from 9 to 23 years. This report, however, relies solely upon information obtained about their lives as children in Tibet. Tibet Justice Center followed the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child in defining a child as every human being below the age of 18. Our study spanned the 7-year period from 1992 to 1999, with emphasis on conditions in Tibet since the Third Forum, roughly 1994 to 99. Tibet Justice Center also interviewed Tibetan teachers, doctors, healthcare professionals, and others who regularly work with Tibetan refugee children and or who had relevant experience inside Tibet. We supplemented these primary sources with extensive background research into the three principal areas on which this report focuses. A full copy of the report, entitled A Generation in Peril, The Lives of Tibetan Children Under Chinese Rule, published under our previous name, International Committee of Lawyers for Tibet, is available from Tibet Justice Center, or can be viewed and downloaded from our website www.tibetjustice.org. We continue in third video.